Well, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I would like to welcome Elodie Harper to this Barnes& Noble virtual event. My name is Jennifer Saint. I am the author of the novels Ariadne, Electra and Atalanta, which are all Sunday Times bestsellers and are retellings of Greek mythology, putting women at the centre of the story. Elodie Harper is a journalist and author whose best-selling Wolf Den Trilogy has won wide acclaim. Her first book in the trilogy, The Wolf Den, won the Glass Bell Award. The second, The House with the Golden Door, was a Sunday Times top 10 bestseller. And the trilogy has sold into 20 territories worldwide and been optioned for TV. But we're here tonight to talk about the final instalment of the trilogy, The Temple of Fortuna. So, Elodie, first of all, just before I launch into questions, I'll just explain. I've got some questions to ask Elodie myself. I have some questions that have been pre-submitted by audience members. But if something occurs to you that you would really like to ask Elodie, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom and we will do our best to answer it. We have got so many questions to get through, so I can't wait to hear your answers. So first of all, I wanted to ask you, Elodie, how it feels to complete this trilogy.
Oh, Jenny, thank you so much for doing this event with me. In the UK, we do a lot of events together, and it's always such a joy, and I really appreciate this. I'm so excited that the Temple of Fortuna is now out in the US and the UK. It felt like a big relief to finish it initially, I have to be honest. But actually now it feels quite emotional because I have to say goodbye to all these characters and even more importantly, say goodbye to Pompei, which, I've got used to imagining for the past 4 years. So that feels very strange to leave that behind. But obviously I'm still talking about it, so it doesn't feel quite over just yet.
And actually, we don't start out in Pompei in this novel. I think we won't give spoilers for the third instalment of the trilogy. I think we will cover some of the ground from the Wolf Den and House with the Golden Door. So it's no secret to say that Amara has found herself in Rome at the beginning of this novel. And this is where we first see the Temple of Fortuna, though we see it again in Pompei. I wondered if you might tell us a little bit about what the significance of this building is and that it's become the title of the book.
So the goddess Fortuna, the Romans saw her as really the force of chance in the world. She was kind of related to Nemesis and fate, but it was a different thing, almost a more frightening thing, because she's so unpredictable and there's no way to control her. Pliny the Elder, who's a character in my books, a fictionalized version of him, but was also a real person who wrote the natural history. He writes quite a lot about Fortuna and says that she's more powerful than God, basically, because she controls everything in the end, the power of chance. And so I wanted this very powerful goddess to be kind of the driving force of this book. I mean, not as a real character, but as an idea, because obviously the eruption of Vesuvius is about as much an event of chance as you can possibly imagine, how it sort of upended everyone's lives. And there is sort of, without too many spoilers, there are several temples to Fortuna that sort of play a key role in the book. And the first is in Rome, and it's a real place. The ruins are in the Lago de Torre Argentina in Rome. It's a circular building now. It's home to stray cats. But the actual goddess Fortuna, you can see in a museum in Rome, and she's absolutely massive. It gives you a sense of how imposing she would have been. She's not life-size. She would have towered over people. And there's also a temple to Fortuna in Pompei, which is kind of a crucial venue before the eruption of Vesuvius. And again, that's somewhere that you can visit and kind of see where people would have worshipped this goddess.
And it's so interesting that you talk about her being this incredibly powerful and unpredictable, uncontrollable force, because when we see Amara in Rome, she has come so far from the Wolf Den. She has come so far from the House with the Golden Door. She's now in imperial Rome and kind of mingling with the very sort of upper echelons of society. But her position still feels so very precarious, like something that could be toppled at any moment. And all the while, she's desperately but secretly missing the daughter that she's left behind in Pompei, feeling as though anything could happen there as well. So, I mean, why is it that Amara she cannot find security? Is it because she is a woman living in a man's world? Is kind of even as far as she's come, is it still impossible for her to feel safe?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right in terms of fortune works both ways. So I think Pliny says, you know, you seldom come across great joys without experiencing great hardship first. And similarly, often terrible disasters follow great joys. So, you know, the fact that Amara at the beginning of the Temple of Fortuna is really at the pinnacle of her power and wealth, whereas we met her in the brothel at the beginning of the Wolf Den when she had nothing and was enslaved. But her role, that there are particular reasons why Amara herself is in a precarious position because of her past and her relationship to Felix. But actually, the role of a courtesan in ancient Rome is quite a fascinating one, because it's a very sort of liminal role in the sense that you don't have the respectability that you would if you were a wealthy woman who was married. Equally, you have a lot more freedom of movement because, in a sense, a certain degree of freedom comes from the fact that you are not respectable. You are able to move freely in the world of men, or freely to a degree, almost, you know, be involved in the sort of world of men, of politics, of power. I didn't base Amara's personality on real courtesans, but you know, I kind of researched the role of real courtesans. There was one called Volumnia Cytheris, who was the mistress of both Mark Antony and Brutus. So, you know, she kind of spanned the political divide through her lovers. And Cicero wrote a very sort of waspish letter about her. Typical Cicero, being a bit gossipy. And he was both like quite in awe of how powerful she was, but also, you know, he was very waspish, but basically saying, but she's such a tart, you know, some jumped up courtesan. And I think his attitude kind of sums up why Amara is both powerful and precarious. She is mixing with powerful men, but she isn't a powerful man. And, you know, her position is based on how attractive she is, as well as how clever she is. But I did, with Demetrius, I wanted to give her a patron who does actually value her for her intelligence. So when we see her in Rome at the start of the book, she is involved in the politics. She's not just kind of a pretty face.
I mean, absolutely. And that's so interesting that kind of in that position, she has got so much more than other women and so much less at the same time. And she's never free of the spectre from Pompeii. And of course, you do bring her back to Pompeii. So it's not a spoiler to say there's a volcano.
Volcano on the cover is a bit of a giveaway.
It's very exciting. Before that happens, though, she meets her old antagonist, Felix, and she meets, I think, more compellingly in some ways, or equally compellingly, her former friend, Victoria. I love the way that you write about female friendships, and not in an altogether positive way all the time. We have seen the full spectrum and intensity of these friendships. And I think when it comes to Victoria, it's so complicated. It's so nuanced. I don't know how I feel about Victoria. I don't know if you do, and if you can talk to us a bit about what's happening there between the two of them.
So the Amara-Victoria relationship, we see it wholly from Amara's point of view. So the whole trilogy is from Amara's point of view, and it's often not my point of view or the reader's point of view. So, for instance, Pliny, I mean, I am fond of Pliny, but I mean, particularly the Pliny in the Wolf Den is a less likable and more problematic character than he is by Fortuna. I got fonder of him as I went along, possibly because I was seeing him through Amara's eyes. But I think, you know, Amara is a biased witness in her own life, and she's very judgmental of Victoria. But I hope the reader won't be as judgmental. For me, Victoria is in many ways the most heartbreaking character in the series. And I wanted to not sentimentalize what it can mean for a woman to be caught up in an abusive relationship, which is what she has with Felix. Many women don't escape this. They remain tied to their abusive partner. This is what happens to Victoria. And I think, you know, when what she does to Amara is unforgivable, but at the same time, when they have their confrontation in the second book, when Victoria says, you wouldn't have treated Dido this way, I think that's true. You know, Amara never respects Victoria the way she respected Dido, and Victoria knows this. So yeah, I find her, as I say, she does some unforgivable things, but I find her a very tragic character, really, ultimately.
And you did base her on a really kind of powerful piece of, was it graffiti in the
Yeah,
brothel?
that's right. Yeah, so there was a real woman called Victoria who worked in the brothel, and she referred to herself as Victrix Victoria, Victoria the Conqueress, and that's where Victoria's kind of fire and
Mm-hmm.
the way that she's so, the way that she wakes up singing in the brothel, the way that she refuses to let life grind her down. There was many things I loved about that character, and that was kind of came out of this graffiti that, yes, Victoria the Conqueress carries a sexual innuendo, but I imagine that the woman who wrote this graffiti about herself repeatedly, I should say, there's a lot of Victoria bragging about herself as a conqueror in the brothel. I imagine this as a woman kind of taking some power from a disempowering situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I think it's done so well for all the women and the way that you portray them, where they really do retain their dignity, whatever it is that they are subjected to. And because you are presenting them in such a fully humanized, such a realized way. And I love your characterization, as you know. But I do also want to talk about the volcano, because that is something that we have been building to, but also it feels almost as though we haven't been, because Vesuvius has been in the background of these novels and nobody's been aware of it until this book when it happens. What was it like to make that switch, to suddenly be capturing this enormous, famous, well-known disaster in real time?
So the volcano, as you say, it kind of, you're both aware of it and not aware of it. So because the characters didn't know Vesuvius was a volcano, in many ways, when I wrote the Wolf Den, I kind of forgot this as well, because what fascinated me about Pompeii was how people lived rather than how they died, and I wanted to sort of recreate life in the town. In the Golden Door, House of the Golden Door, there are these earth tremors. I had to set the scene for what was genuinely happening. Seismic activity would have been building over this period. And then in book 3, I didn't want to end it with a volcano, because what a cheat if that was just like it went off and then it was all over and we didn't get proper resolution. And during the research, what really fascinated me was actually the relief effort that took place afterwards. Like the emperor visited. In fact, one non-fiction author compared it to the tragedy of Hurricane Katrina, and when the president of the time went to visit the disaster site, that what Titus, the Emperor Titus, was doing was actually quite similar, like a PR exercise, but also a means to try and raise morale and show that the state was doing something. And the state did do a lot. There was rebuilding there was a refugee crisis. So that was something I really wanted to tackle in this last book, as much as a volcano. But of course, we've got this amazing eyewitness account of the eruption of Vesuvius from Pliny the Elder's nephew, Pliny the Younger, which I draw on a lot for that section.
And how did he see it? If that, how do we have a surviving eyewitness account? Where was he while this was happening?
Well, so while Pliny the Elder went off and launched the rescue mission, so he went straight into the danger zone. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, who was about 17 at that time, was like, I think I'll stay and read my books. So he was in the comparative safety of Misenum, which was affected, but not by the pyroclastic flows. So, they had debris and darkness and towards the end of the eruption, but he was actually able to observe what was happening, and obviously spoke to people in his uncle's rescue party, so that he was able to give a very full account of what Pliny the Elder was doing, even though he wasn't there. And it's an incredibly evocative account. So sometimes the Romans can be quite stuffy and not terribly personal in the ways that they write about things. But the thing about Pliny the Younger is he does love a bit of detail. And so we have these incredible details, like the fact that people wore pillows on their heads to protect themselves from the debris, that even though it was the middle of the day, they were all carrying lights and torches and lamps because it was so dark. About the pumice stone falling. the fact that, you know, they had to leave because of the buildup of pumice stone and the earthquakes, so where his uncle initially was in Stabiae. So yeah, there are just so many kind of really evocative details that are given in that account, so which made it, you know, a lot easier for me to write about.
We are so lucky that that survives. I think that what an amazing.
Ordinary. Yeah.
And the character that I really, really want to ask you about before I move on to audience questions is probably my favourite, and that is the character of Britannica, who has become. We saw her in the brothel in the Wolf Den, just bewildered, raging, really difficult for everyone to communicate with or to understand. And she has become such a firm friend of Amara. And we see her in this novel as this ferocious female gladiator. And I was so intrigued reading this to know, is Britannica like Victoria? Is she based on real life case studies? Did we have female gladiators? Could this have been something possible? I really hope so.
So we did have real life gladiators, but actually I think Britannica has many parallels to your character Atalanta. And one of the things I absolutely love in your book is how Atalanta is so unapologetically herself. Both Britannica and Atalanta worship Artemis. Obviously in your book, the gods are real characters, and Artemis, you know, a bit like Fortuna in mine, but she's a real character, and yours is this kind of terrifying, unpredictable force, and also a female warrior. And so, you know, elements of Artemis are present in Britannica's personality, I would say. And also Britannica, you know, when she adopts a foreign god, having arrived in Italy, it's Artemis that she chooses. So yeah, I do think there are a lot of parallels between our two characters. In terms of actual real gladiators, there were women gladiators, which I just find mind-blowing, really. So, and they were kind of split into two groups. So there were kind of, obviously all gladiatorial combat was horrendous in that it's people fighting each other to the death for entertainment. But, you know, sometimes when women gladiators were used, it was kind of even worse and carried a slightly titillating sexual element. So the Emperor Domitian had that kind of gladiatorial show with women. But there is also evidence that women were kind of just ordinary fighters, and regarded in a similar way to the men. So we've got records of them fighting at Ostia and kind of quite regular combats. And there's also this wonderful marble relief from Halicarnassus in Turkey, which was then under Roman control. And it shows two women gladiators, Amazonia and Achillea, and it records that they came to an honorable draw. And the way that they are portrayed is identical to how male fighters were portrayed. So they're not sexualized, they're not sort of prettified or anything like that. They are sort of formidable fighters. And I also think, you know, this kind of glamour as well as the horror and the gore and the grime of gladiatorial life is captured in a Roman law that existed to prevent highborn women from becoming gladiators. And the fact that law exists means that some must have tried.
Wow. So, and I mean, I guess so. When we kind of think about the way that you portray women's options in these books,
Yeah.
I can kind of see why that might be an appeal, kind of a bit more freedom and possibly a really terrible death.
Yes.
But the chance
not something that appeals to me, to be honest.
I mean, not personally, but I guess kind of the chance to make something of yourself in a world where there may be not so many.
I think so. Well, like your Atalanta, you know, when she sets out on her quest, you know, for Artemis, but also for herself, you know, and moving, you know, and Atalanta is very much in the world of men in your book. And it's that feeling of being an outsider to your own sex, I guess. You know, you're able to escape some of the constraints as well as having not having the protections as well as the constraints. So yeah, a bit like being a courtesan, it's this strange role that's both not respectable but does carry some more freedom. And I really wanted that for Britannica. Like, she's one of my favorite characters, and I wanted her to have also reached a point of empowerment by the end of the books.
Yeah, which I think is incredible, and it's really that kind of hero's journey, which always carries that risk, but the glory will hopefully be worth it. Hopefully for Britannica. So I have so many questions from audience members who have pre-submitted their questions that I'm going to ask you. But if anyone has got anything else they would like to ask, please put it in the Q&A box and we will do our best to get to it if you have got more questions to ask Elodie. But the first two from Stuart Griffin and Dominique Herrera, very similar questions. Stuart would like to know what your main inspiration is for this book, and Dominique has asked what inspired you to write the whole trilogy.
So I think those two answers are kind of similar. So the inspiration initially for the trilogy was I've always been fascinated by ancient Rome, and it's something I studied, at school and then university. And I was like very aware that it tends to be quite one-sided, told from kind of the elite male perspective, because those are the writers who've mainly come down to us. And it's, that's just how it's been perceived, and that there was this kind of gap where we didn't have so much information on the lives of women and enslaved people. And in academic work and in archaeology, that has not been the case for many years now. And what drew me to Pompeii in particular is just the incredible work that's been done uncovering the lives of ordinary people, of women, of freed people, of enslaved people. That's really been a big focus there. We don't see it as much in fiction. So that's why I wanted to write about Pompeii from that perspective. I chose the Lupana because it's probably the most famous building in Pompeii. It's incredibly well preserved. The Lupana is the brothel. And I felt like if you were looking at the lives of overlooked Romans, those were, probably the most overlooked group you could get. Not only in their time, but also kind of in ours. Like, it's seen as a bit of a joke or a titillating thing, this brothel that survives. And I didn't want to look at it that way. In terms of the Temple of Fortuna particularly, so that was all part of the inspiration. But I think, all the books have a very different vibe. So the Wolf Den is very much about sisterhood. It's the most brutal of the books as well. The House with the Golden Door is much more reflective. And then the Temple of Fortuna, and the House of the Golden Door is also more of a love story. But the Temple of Fortuna is a really sort of plot-driven, pacey, dramatic book. And I wanted to write one like that as well. So that was kind of, I feel like the trilogy covers sort of different moods.
And it absolutely does. Cheyenne Helfrich has asked something that I am so interested to know, which is that most of us, because of the infamous historical context, imagine Pompeii as a city of ash, but you are able to vividly illustrate a time before Vesuvius's eruption. So she would like to know how you went about researching Pompeii's historical setting and how you brought it to life, how you effectively depict Pompeii and its demographic.
So I think with Pompeii, I approached it. I read quite a lot of books about it. I read a lot of books that had loads of photographs in them, because a lot of it is about the kind of visual side. And I also visited the site. I went to the Archaeological Museum in Naples, which is where a lot of the frescoes and the mosaics and the objects are preserved. So, which they aren't on the site anymore. I mean, there are still frescoes and mosaics on the site, but a lot of the precious objects are in Naples. So it was kind of like a visual immersion in that world, and then walking through Pompeii, particularly around the area of the Lupana, to really get a sense of what Amara's physical world was like. And walking into the houses, nothing gives you a sense of the atmosphere of Pompeii as much as walking around it. And then in terms of, so I gathered all this massive material and research and books and all the rest of it. But then, and also, kind of related books about the lives of enslaved people and of women. But then I think when you're writing about the past, you have to bear in mind that for the people living in it, it wasn't the past. And if you stuff too much of your research in, it just unbalances a book. So I always think of historical writing as a bit like an impressionist painting. You pick out details, you're giving an impression of a visual impression of a place. And that's what I try to do. The way that you would describe your own street, there are specific details that are so obvious you wouldn't describe them. So those are the sorts of things that I didn't go into detail with in Pompei. The minutiae of how things work, even if I found that interesting, because Amara wouldn't be noticing that. And I also made sure that my main character, whose point of view we follow throughout the books, is an outsider to Pompei. She's a newcomer, so she notices more. So she's kind of because she's our guide, she's seeing more.
That is absolutely fascinating. The way you explain that is just incredible that you can sort of be so precise about your process. And I just wonder if Alyssa's question in the Q&A actually might relate to this a little bit. She wants to know how your experience as a journalist might have prepared you to write this book series.
So I think the thing that my experience as a journalist has done more than anything else is because in the UK, it's actually quite different from the US. So I'm a broadcast journalist. I work in television, and we have incredibly strict laws that mean you cannot take a viewpoint. So, the Ofcom code, it has to be impartial, accurate. You can't have an opinion. So when I report a story, regardless of what my feelings are, I have to present all different viewpoints. And the channel that I work for is legally obliged to present all viewpoints. It doesn't have kind of an angle or an edge. It's not a left wing or a right wing broadcaster. And I think that has probably been the most helpful thing that for fiction in terms of building characters. It's just become a habit of mind to be aware that there are always multiple viewpoints to everything. And even though you might think you know what the best idea is, you need to reflect the whole.
That's fascinating again. Speaking of characters, Sam Davies has mentioned one of my personal favourites. I don't know if he's one of your favourites, Elodie, Manda, whose narrative appears to be concluded in the Wolf Den. Sam would like to know, does Manda make an appearance in the final book, and what inspired his character and relationship with Amara? He has written so beautifully.
Oh, thank you. So I hope it's not a spoiler to say Manda does make an appearance in the last book. I won't say how or where or what, but I felt like his story arc wasn't completed. I think with Manda and Amara, I wanted to capture, the real innocence and preciousness of first love. And these are two people who could have been happy, but their lives have made this impossible, really. The sort of brutality of their lives. She can't, at the end of the Wolf Den, choose Manda. It is impossible. Even if she said to Rufus, "No, this is the man I love," she's not going to end up with Manda. She's just going to remain a slave. So, yeah, I saw it as kind of a very precious first love that is destroyed by reality. So I guess that's where the inspiration from that came. I know a lot of people are very fond of Manda. I'm fonder of Felix. And I think he's a more appropriate partner for Amara, really. But she has a lot of guys. I kind of sometimes, people want the woman to have just one guy. And I just think, well, not that I would compare my books to the James Bond franchise, but James Bond gets a new love interest with every film. So I felt like Amara could have several love interests with every book.
Absolutely. And she has, it's kind of a precursor to the difficult decision she makes in the House of the Golden Door. We see her make that agonizing decision about Manda, but then such a harder decision when it comes to the end of the Golden Door.
Yeah.
But that's me, and other people have asked questions. So rather than kind of going down that track, I will ask when there is a major spoiler, by the way, for the Wolf Den. So cover your ears if you don't want to know what happens at the end of the Wolf Den.
Mute just for a second.
Elizabeth Weiner wants to know, what led you to kill Dido off at the end of the first book? Was it a mechanism of displaying how helpless Amara truly was as a woman in ancient Rome? And why did you break our hearts, Elodie?
Oh, I didn't want to kill Dido. I genuinely didn't want to kill her, and that wasn't what I originally envisaged. There were two reasons why I felt like I had to do that. And one is related to that, to show I felt like I really pushed the boundaries of how realistic my portrayal of Amara's life was already. I tried to keep within sort of vaguely plausible possibilities for a woman in the ancient world, but obviously she has quite a run of luck, landing with Pliny the Elder and then getting a rich patron and getting out the brothel. And I just felt if she took Dido with her, doesn't really contain much jeopardy or tension or drama for a trilogy. If she'd have had Dido, she would have had no reason to start a relationship with Philos, because that role in her life, not a sexual romantic role, but the role of love and of closeness and of having somebody who truly belongs to her, would already have been filled by Dido. So maybe she wouldn't have felt the need to take great risks. So there was that I felt. I just wanted to be true to how brutal a woman's life was in that period. Exactly. I'm so sorry, I've forgotten the name of the person who asked the question, but that was absolutely, what I was doing. There's also like just kind of with a writer hat on, if you're writing a trilogy, you have to have a certain degree of jeopardy. You can't make it predictable. And I think if you kill off a major character that you love, not just that is a kind of, character that you're hoping your readers love, but, a popular main character who is really central, then it kind of makes the whole reading experience a lot more fraught, and people don't know what you're going to do. It suggests this is a writer who's unpredictable. I can't predict the end of this trilogy. Anything could happen. Anyone could die. And so I felt that was also quite an important part of the reading process. And I tried, what I didn't want to do with Dido's death was, because it really annoys me when I read books, particularly a series, if a major character dies and then nobody ever talks about them ever again. So Dido is still, in my opinion, a central character in House of the Golden Door. Her death, it leads to what happens between Victoria and Amara. It leads to what happens between Amara and Philos. Dido is constantly on Amara's mind. She is present through her absence. So I also, I felt like I wanted to explore grief and what happens to a relationship after someone dies, because that relationship doesn't end. You still love the person. They still continue to be a part of your life. They're just not physically with you.
Yeah, and she's still inspiring Amara. We've talked a lot about the women. Timoteo Paul would like to know what inspired the character of Felix. His relationship with Amara is one of the most fascinating parts of the trilogy. Other characters go in and out of the story. Why did you keep him as a recurring character and a big part of the story?
So right from the beginning, I felt like the Amara Felix arc was going to carry all the way through. He's her nemesis, and in many ways, they are kind of Felix is like a dark mirror of Amara. They have many similarities. They're both very ruthless people. They're both survivors. And in the character of Felix, so one thing that I did encounter in my work as a journalist, so I interviewed a prison psychologist who worked with Category A prisoners in the UK. That's kind of like the most, the people who are in for the most serious offences. And I asked her about her work and what work she did with the prisoners that she worked with. And she said that she had to try and help them come to terms with the terrible things they've done and the terrible things that had been done to them, because it was almost always both. And I think with Felix, although his life story is not an excuse for how he behaves, because, obviously lots of people have terrible beginnings in life and they don't go on to do the things that Felix does, or end up in prison for violent offences. At the same time, he is someone who grew up with brutality, who knew nothing like brutality, unlike Amara, who grew up in a loving family. And so she kind of has that as her template. That's not what Felix had. So I wanted him to be although he's an absolute villain, also to be a character that we could at least empathize with. And yeah, the relationship between Amara and Felix, it's a love-hate relationship. There is this very strong bond between them. And
I do empathize with him. I agree. Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, I think that's also exploring, Roman slavery was this really strange institution where people who were enslaved could form these very close relationships with the people who owned them. But it's a very it's the power imbalance is obviously horrendous in this situation, but at the same time, it's a very intense connection, and I think that's also what Amara and Felix have. He can't accept that she's moved on from him as well, so that's partly what the tug is.
Yeah, there's a lot of male pride, I feel, with Felix.
Totally.
that gets in his way. So there are quite a few questions about your writing process, but I think just one more about the kind of the book itself, and before I ask you some of these questions, is what was the hardest scene to write in this book? And I've just lost the person who asked it. Oh, it's Abina Miles. What was the hardest scene to write in the Temple of Fortuna? If you can tell us.
I don't think I can tell that one without spoilers. Yeah. So, quite a lot of people die in the Temple of Fortuna because a volcano erupts. So, any of those deaths were quite sad to write. I think, the hardest things to write about in the trilogy was the sexual violence in the Wolf Den. And I was really, really careful not to write any graphic violence. But, it's quite a dark book, and thinking about that aspect of things was sometimes quite challenging. So,
I mean, I would say that you handle it so sensitively. I don't think we are ever in any doubt about what these women endure, but you are never lingering and making it unpleasant for the read, making it feel exploitative in any way. I think you handle it so skillfully. So there are quite a few questions, which I might have to kind of group together just a little bit for reasons of time, where people really want to know about your writing process. Quite a number of people want to know, do you have a writing routine, and do you plan your novels? And particularly, did you plan the whole arc of the trilogy?
So I don't have a writing routine so much because I kind of fit in writing when I'm not doing my other job or kind of other responsibilities in my life. So, I tend to, I'm going to try and have more of a writing routine with the next book, but yeah, I write when I have free to write. But yeah, I really planned this trilogy very, very meticulously. So before I write a book, I plan it chapter by chapter. Very detailed chapter plan. The Wolf Den plan was 30,000 words long. None of the other plans have been that long. it was chapter by chapter, pretty much everything that happened in each chapter, so that then the actual writing flowed really fast. And I find the more detailed my plan is, the faster the writing is. And I had to plan it being a trilogy because you don't want to kill off a character in book 1 or 2 that you need in book 3. So you have to be pretty sure of where you're going with it.
Okay, so another question about the general idea of writing. Well, 2 really. How do you decide that your idea is good enough to turn into a novel? That's from Praz Patel. And I just think linked to that is, what do you do if you have writer's block, from Marsha Bullock? So I think these are both kind of about ideas and faith.
Yeah. I think you should answer some of these questions as well, actually, Jenny, because I'm sure people, be really interested. So writer's block, I mean, it's horrible when you feel like you can't write, and the only answer is just to write something. Even if you feel it's rubbish, just keep writing and it will eventually start flowing again. That's the only advice I can have. If you're really, really, really stuck, try writing something completely different. Write a poem or a fairy tale or a short story or a scene from much further on in the book that you're going to enjoy. Just anything to just write. And then the one about how do you know if your idea is good enough? Well, I mean, I guess you never do. And as a writer, you carry that insecurity, are people going to read my story? You get moments of validation along the way, if your agent signs you for it, if your publisher buys it, all these things. But, ultimately, will it sell? Will people like it? I mean, you just have to take a punt. What do you think about all those questions, actually, basically? Do you how I don't actually know. I'm really curious to know how much you plan your novels, because that's not something we've talked about before.
No. So I would say about that one, how do you know if the idea is good enough? My answer to that is, if you want to read it, then I think somebody else will. So I always think, what is the book that want to read that I don't have, and then I'm going to try and write that book. I have always been a planner. I was so interested in what you just said about the more you plan, the easier it is to write, because I found my worst bout of writer's block has been actually writing the book I am currently writing, um, which was really well planned.
Oh
And
no.
in that, and I think every book is different, but I find that sometimes a really, really tight plan can be restrictive, and actually you want to go off in another direction. And I found that the writer's block was the kind of push pull of, but my plan says I've got to go here, but my heart and my brain want to go over here. And it was when those two things clashed
Interesting.
that I found it really, really difficult to push through. And I get through right. I mean, in that case, it did require a little bit of loosening and just saying, actually, it's okay. The plan is not working. It's going somewhere else
And
where I didn't know it was going to go.
I have to say, I am so excited about that book. If people listening don't know what the subject is, am I allowed to say?
Okay, go ahead.
Or you should say it's your book.
Because I'm going to ask you the same question in a minute, because so many people want to know it. And so I am writing about Hera, the queen of the goddesses, and she cannot be contained. I discovered by a plan. She wants to do her own thing, and she absolutely will. And I think to get through that writer's block, I mean, change direction if you need to, but I set myself tiny, tiny writing goals. I can't write something else. I can't say I'm going to write another scene. I have to move chronologically, but I will do it 100 words at a time if that's what it takes, and then take a break. So I really think there's never one answer to those questions, is there? Every writer is different. Every book is different.
Somebody posted a celebrations emoji at the news of Hera, and I have to say, that is my feeling about it too. I literally can't wait for Hera. So excited.
I'm feeling so celebratory about it now. But Elodie, please tell us. So many people have asked, I can't even read out all of their names. So many people want to know, what now for you after completing this incredible trilogy? What are you going to bring us next?
So my next book after the Wolf Den Trilogy is being published in the UK and the US, and it is called Boudicca's Daughter. So it's about the daughter of the famous British rebel queen who fought the Romans. It will have a cameo from Britannica in it. Obviously, Boudicca's rebellion was many years before the Wolf Den, so Britannica's only a little child at this point. But yes, that's what the book's about. And a bit like the Volcano, which goes off partway through Fortuna, Boudicca's rebellion will have happened partway through the book, and then a lot of the daughter's life is the aftermath. But Boudica did have two daughters. They're central to her story, and I'm really excited. I'm in the planning stage at the moment. So yeah.
Well, I can speak on everybody's behalf when I say we are all so incredibly excited for that as well. And we cannot wait to see what you come up with next. But we know it will be fantastic, and so many celebration emojis for that one. So thank you so much, everybody who submitted questions. Thank you so much, Elodie, for your fascinating, brilliant answers. We've had a great time talking this evening. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Those of you who bought a ticket to this event that included the Temple of Fortuna with signed book plate, the book will be delivered to you within 8 to 10 business days. And if you don't yet have a copy of the book on the way, it can be ordered any time of night or day from barnesandnoble.com or at your local Barnes and Noble store. So please go along and get yourself a copy. Thank you very much again, Elodie. Thank you, everybody who submitted their questions.
Thank you, Jenny, so much. Thank you so much, Jenny. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
For having us.
Thank you, Barnes and Noble. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.